The Spiritual Pilgrim, Miles H. Hodges. A personal mission statement. I see myself as called as a teacher to help prepare those students whom God has put in my trust by helping them discover the particular role God has called or commissioned them to perform as servant leaders, and to prepare them to be as wise as serpents and innocent as doves in carrying out that commission. My particular goals, in the order of increasing importance, are to help them develop 1. Basic knowledge concerning our world and its ways, and techniques for adding to that knowledge as future needs arise. 2. The wisdom to know how to use that knowledge to make wise decisions as servant leaders. And 3. The character to ensure that this wisdom will always be used in the service of mankind and to the glory of God. The 2 paths. I am a teacher, though mostly in the style of a preacher, and vice versa. I teach when I preach, and I preach when I teach. When called to speak about what I know to be true, I have but one thought in mind: to invite others to consider with me the world that lays at our feet, with the choice before us to either approach it God's way or man's way. I know the choice well. I have, at various stages in my life, pursued one course, then the other. I have played it man's or the world's way, a very successful organization man as a university professor, a government administrator, an IBM systems analyst, and as an ordained Presbyterian minister and contributing member of a great corporate church. But I've also played it God's way, living on life's edge, doing street ministry, jail ministry, church revitalization, and Christian school teaching, trusting in God to help support a family of 6 while I devoted myself to his ministry. Between the two, the better choice by far has been to play it life God's way. I learned this at an early age, even when it wasn't very clear to me exactly who God was, but I did have some sense of a higher hand in my life, and thus lived boldly. Now I play it with the clearest of understanding, teaching young Americans about how choosing for God will fill their lives with vision, significance, and a deep sense of being alive to life. Often I put the matter a different way, in contrasting what I term the mysticism of the Christian life versus the mechanical process of living the life of worldly materialism. Recovering a Christian political science. I am one who rather late in life came to understand the world we inhabit in biblical terms. I have become a Christian political scientist. Over time, I grew increasingly amazed at how the Bible, especially the Jewish scriptures or Old Testament, speaks so powerfully about the social condition of man, the heart of social dynamics that pose themselves to all humans, Americans, Jews, Persians, Greeks, Romans, or whatever. My academic background, my university studies at the University of Geneva and the University of Illinois, my doctoral studies at Georgetown University, my 15 years of university teaching international studies in Alabama, was largely within the field we call political science. Typical of the professionals in the field of political science, I was a complete secularist during most of those years. However, I was by no means a utopianist, as has been typical of most American secular political scientists since the mid-20th century. My year at the University of Geneva in Switzerland, my years of master's and doctoral work at Georgetown, particularly my master's study of the failed African nationalist movement of the 1960s in South Africa, and my doctoral study of the endless linguistic cultural problems afflicting bicultural Belgium, had made me a through-and-through realist. I had no fancy ideas about the instinctive nobility of man, nor the belief in the natural historical path to democratic utopia that afflicts American political science. I well understood the tough side of man, displayed endlessly throughout human history. This left me little to cheer about as a student of society. As a realist, I understood that man was fated to struggle, thrive for a while, then weaken and die on this planet in an endless cycle. Then God showed up. Through a marvelous set of circumstances, I began to discover that the greatest of all political science textbooks, far above all others, happened to be the Bible. I quickly recognized that the God who created the universe according to a precise set of principles we call physics, chemistry, and biology, had also created the principles for human life as well. We were biological creatures, but we were more than that. We were complex creatures of a free will and tremendous mental capacity. Given this biological principle largely, it seems, to be the one thing in creation able to share with God in the glory of all creation. But the complexities of human life, especially social life, are way above our ability to clarify in the same way we've been able to clarify the laws that guide the physical universe around us. We have tried to understand, and thus manage, human life the way we do the physical world around us. But we have failed again and again. Well, that's the realist in me speaking. But God did not leave us clueless about the principles by which He designed human life. He was much more forthright in setting these principles in front of us. He presented these to us through the ancient wise ones who learned how to connect with the voice of God so that they could learn and pass on to us these principles. We call these prophets. But actually they were scientists, social and psychological scientists, laying out for our clear understanding the laws by which God designated life, or at least what He intends for life in all of its glory to be for us, if we used our free will to live by those principles. Having made this discovery in the mid-1980s and having a deep hunger to learn more about this divine wisdom, I left my post at the University of South Alabama to take up seminary studies in Princeton, still ever the student and hardly with the thought of ever pastoring in mind at the time. But God continued to show me ever deeper these Christian principles as He directed my path to become a pastor in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Everything from street and prison ministry to standard Presbyterian ministry. And finally, a Christian high school teacher in eastern Pennsylvania. In short, what I came to discover in the story of ancient Israel and in the life and teachings of Jesus is how life works under the hand of the one who made all heaven and earth. The patterns are clear and as unshakable as the laws of gravity, thermodynamics, quantum mechanics, etc. There in the pages of the Bible is the very clearest explanation of how man is to live in accordance with the natural social laws of God. The American way. I am, through and through, an American, loving deeply the great Anglo-American cultural legacy that has been ours for 400 years, though I have lived, studied, and worked abroad much of my life, and find compelling reasons to be deeply impressed with the cultures of other people as well. I truly appreciate and celebrate the accomplishments of other cultures, European, Middle Eastern, and Asian in particular. I enjoy exploring the philosophies, arts, and life histories that they generated over countless generations and centuries. But most of all, I enjoyed surveying work that God has done among us in America since He first planted an Anglo nation on this continent, one which continued to take in waves of immigrants and risk-takers who would flourish because they dared to help build our nation to the glory of God, receiving in return blessing upon blessing of an awesome nature. I take great pleasure in reflecting on the social and cultural miracles by which God and man together moved forward this unsophisticated but nonetheless very inventive American culture. And I especially love to invite others to share in that reflection with me. The call to restore America's forgotten Christian political legacy. I today teach not only as a matter of great pleasure, but also as a matter of great urgency. Somewhere along the way, America chose to forget that this country was founded by people who understood clearly the principles of a Christian political science and who, well equipped with his wisdom, boldly brought our nation to greatness against great adversity. The Puritan New Englanders of the early 1600s, who carved Yankee America out of the forests of America, understood these divine principles of political science very well. They worked consciously in accordance with the laws and the ever-revealing will of God to build a city upon a hill. 150 years later, the fathers of our hard-fought independence and the world's first truly lasting democracy also were well aware of these principles of God's political science, quick to affirm that nothing of America's new experiment in national democracy would ever work apart from the people continuing awareness of the overriding or ultimate supervision or judgments of God. But, as happened with ancient Israel, we Americans, who are sinners like the rest, from time to time have fallen in love with our own logic rather than God's. We like the feeling of freedom, that is, not having to be accountable to anything other than our own private or personal wills. Today we are caught up big time in one of these great love affairs with ourselves, and our social institutions are suffering terribly as a result. So I teach and preach. It is never too late to do something about our sins. After all, sin is not a new or unexpected condition that we suffer from. God has dealt with man's sins for thousands of years. Nonetheless, without the wisdom of understanding the problems of sin, we will likely misuse the freedom God has given us to block rather than to aid God's redeeming work among us. This is the great tragedy of human history. A people who once walked mightily with God and thereby found greatness, but in that greatness forgot God as the source of that greatness, listened to the flattery of the deceiver who convinced them that their greatness was from their own cleverness and special gifts, and were led away from that God-given greatness into social decay and collapse. It's not a new story, but it does not need to be repeated in America. So I teach and preach. The need to free the sense of soul from its bondage to mechanism. I am old enough, I am now in my later 70s, to remember when America was not what it has become today. I remember when America referred to its people, its homes, its local communities, its countryside and cities, and not essentially its Washington, D.C. government as it seems today. I remember when America was stirred to action through the popular appeal of charismatic leaders able to inspire the volunteer spirit in Americans to do the right thing. I remember America when it was not run by faceless social programmers or managers, such as those today who have come to assume the responsibility of life for us so that we are now left free merely to pursue life's many entitlements. I remember America before multitudinous insurance programs and battalions of lawyers. The need to recover a deep sense of social responsibility and moral integrity. I remember when we were led by the greatest generation, before we became socially lazy and culturally vulgar. I remember when life focused on family rather than personal profession, when we lived in communities, when we faced our social problems and tried to overcome them rather than escape them. I remember when schooling was focused on education or the cultivation of wisdom rather than on vocational or professional training. It is important to understand the difference between education and training. You can train dogs, but you cannot educate them. Dictatorships train their people, but dare not educate them. I remember life before SATs and ACTs. I also remember when character counted more than celebrity as the measure of a person. And most importantly, I remember when piety was a trait we esteemed and not despised as some form of bigotry. The need for great American leaders. So I teach and preach. I teach the youth who will be America's leaders of tomorrow. I teach them not just facts. I teach them about life's problems and its long-standing solutions. I tell them stories about situations similar to ours today. It's called history. I teach them about great individuals whose sense of destiny shaped huge social outcomes, both good and bad. I teach them the value of bravery and the tragedy of arrogance. I teach them about the sources and possibilities of social power and the great accompanying dangers if not handled well. Most of all, I teach them about the rules or laws of human life, individual and social, that God set out for us, rules and laws that must never be disregarded, just as with any other laws in creation. With respect to the ways of the world, I teach them to be as wise as serpents. The path to greatness. I teach them to be alpha males and females, but alpha only as Jesus showed us what it means to be alpha. For Jesus was and is the ultimate alpha and omega. The alpha person is the servant to all, as Jesus was the servant to all. Service to others above concern for self. The makings of a true warrior, of one of the greatest of leaders, is what I teach them. I stress again and again the importance of surrendering self to such service in order to receive in exchange a greatness of character that produces the true leader. Of course, in our ego-soaked culture of personal self-sufficiency and personal self-advancement, this is a virtually impossible task. But not for one who has turned his or her life over to a power greater than self. Faith, as Jesus taught and modeled, not in self but in God, is the absolute key to such power. Without faith in a higher source of life, there is nothing to life but a shallowness of purpose, or total lack thereof, an existentialist emptiness. After all, we are, in all of creation, uniquely crafted to be more than just mere creatures, mere things, living a rather tightly bounded physical existence. We have been given souls and spirits that can soar in our thoughts and feelings to the outer reaches of the universe and even beyond. We can, in our imaginations, exist in a time that once was and a time that will someday be, as if it were the time we now inhabit. What awesome creatures are we, if we do not fall into the materialist spiritual trap of seeing ourselves as mere mammals and just so much genetic material confined to the here and the now of existence. Being truly a great person is counterintuitive. Everything about the ego we are born with wants to fight any form of surrender to others. We want to stand apart from others where we can provide for our own protection, and thus our own logic, where Satan prowls, does us in. It is only when we escape that self-serving logic that we finally take hold of the greatness that makes us sons and daughters of the Most High God, whose plans, thoughts, and words, that is, God's logos, direct all existence. It is only when we reach toward God as our Abba, Daddy, as Jesus constantly directed us to do, and become joined with his logos that we attain greatness. In this self-surrender, we take on the quality of becoming innocent as doves and achieve true human greatness. The teachings offered on this website. I do not propose to offer on these web pages the complete picture or even significant portion of what I teach. What I teach can be learned only through actual personal contact, in class or wherever. What is posted here is some small portion of those teachings, a factual backup of sorts. However, it is wisdom and not just mere knowledge, character and not just mere fact, that ultimately is what my teaching strives to pass on to my students, and what my students pass back to me in exchange. Something very much alive, something that cannot be found on these pages. Nonetheless, I hope that what is offered here can be useful in putting a perspective on life that is otherwise largely lacking in modern Western or American material secular culture. Hopefully this perspective will stir within you key questions, and in this raising of questions stimulate a spiritual pilgrimage of your own, a pilgrimage that might direct your path to the feet of a great teacher or teachers, a pilgrimage that will lead you to want to become yourself a great teacher someday. Then you too might show others how to become wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Finally, what it is specifically that I am trying to teach my students, or what any well-informed American needs to know about our world. Thesis. Societies are founded, held together, moved ahead by social ideas or grand dreams. Vital historical background. Point 1. English America was founded in the early 1600s not on one but on two very different social dreams of Virginia and New England. What were they specifically? How did the European Enlightenment of the late 1600s and the 1700s challenge the traditional dream of the entire Christian West? To what extent was the Enlightenment's grand dream effective in producing social change in both Europe and America? 3. Was America indeed founded in the late 1700s by a Revolutionary War and the subsequent creation from scratch by the Founding Fathers of an entirely new constitutional republic? Or were those events simply the determined protection by Americans of a political dream and related political habits already a century and a half old at that time? 4. Both England and France were the great imperialist powers of the 19th century, that is the 1800s. Each was led forth by their own grand imperialist dream. What were they? 5. At the same time that England and France were playing out their imperialism, America was practicing its manifest destiny. How did that underlay not only America's western expansion, but also bring the northern and southern halves of the country to bloody conflict? 6. In the 1700s and 1800s, Russia was trying to emerge out of an Eastern isolationism produced by centuries of hostile neighbors overrunning it because it possessed no natural boundaries protecting its heartland. How did that work out for Mother Russia? 7. Germany suffered from much the same problem as Russia. How were the Germans finally able to construct a German nation in the latter part of the 1800s? 8. Socio-political progressivism, produced from a blend of Christian evangelism and secular humanism, moved up alongside English, French, American, German, Russian nationalism at the turn of the 1800s into the early 1900s. What exactly was its social agenda? 9. How did nationalism, imperialism, and progressivism combine to form the underlying political, economic, social, intellectual, and spiritual momentum of the 20th century? 10. What was President Wilson's social agenda in trying to make sense of a great war that had mired down in a bloody stalemate among competing European nationalisms? How effective was he in implementing his social agenda? 11. The 1920s marked a period of intense distrust of anyone's larger social agenda. What focused the lives of the post-war world in America and Western Europe? 12. How did Stalin take Lenin's dream and transform it into a powerful social vision for Russia? 13. The early 1930s collapsed even the feeble social moral foundations of America and the West. How did that affect Asia? How did that affect Western Europe, especially Germany? How did that affect America? 14. How was World War II a test of strength among traditional and rising grand dreams of societies in Europe, Asia, and America? How did that work out for everyone? 15. How did the Cold War arise out of the political rearrangement of global power following World War II? How did Americans see this less as a matter of geopolitics and more a question of intense ideological rivalry? How did the Cold War reshape American society? How did the Cold War affect the revival of Europe, of Asia's emergence into social independence, of the Middle East, of Latin America, of Africa? 16. America went through a major shift in its grand dream in the 1960s. What was Kennedy's dream? What was King's dream? What was Johnson's dream? What did the 1960s do to these dreams? 17. How did Nixon attempt to reverse the course of Johnson's legacy and set America on a more realist course? How did that work out for him? How did Carter propose to push America ahead on a more moral course in spreading American constitutional or democratic ideals abroad? How successful was he in seeing his ideals planted around the world? 19. What was the cause of the collapse of Russia's communist or Soviet empire in the late 1980s, early 1990s? How did that impact Russia? How did that impact the rest of the world? And now, today, 20. How did 9/11 change the optimistic picture of the post-Cold War world? How did America under Bush Jr. respond to the perceived challenge coming out of the Middle East? How did Obama set up his own response pattern? What was the Arab Spring all about? What grand dreams seems to drive the Muslim world today? What are its challenges? How is the West trying to answer the world of Islam? 21. How did the Russian-American reset button of Obama-Clinton work out for America? What dream has Putin put before the Russian-speaking world? How have America and the West responded to the Putin challenge? 22. How did China move forward from the days of the Maoist Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution into full membership in the international industrial and financial community? What is China's grand dream today? How will this likely reshape the international status quo? 23. What was the grand dream of the new Europe? What were its successes? What have been its shortcomings? Where is this once great subcontinent headed today? And finally, 24. Domestically, America seems caught up in a fierce cultural war between Christian traditionalism and secular humanist progressivism. What social forces are behind this conflict of grand dreams? How is this played out politically, socially, morally, and spiritually for the nation? What do you think lies ahead for the nation 10 years from now, 25, 50?